When JD Vance, dressed casually, is ignored and kicked out of a liberal restaurant, he doesn't get angry. He sees it as a glimpse into the everyday mistreatment many Americans face. What he does next will shock you and change everything. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The rain fell in a soft drizzle over Washington, D.C., the dim glow of streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement as JD Vance stepped out of his unmarked car. He pulled up the hood of his sweatshirt against the cold, his breath curling into mist. No flashing lights, no motorcade, no security detail trailing behind him. Just a man, dressed in worn jeans and a hoodie, blending into the city like any other working-class American. Tonight, JD wasn't the Vice President of the United States. Tonight, he was just a man looking for a quiet meal. He walked toward Liberty Diner, a well-known liberal restaurant in the heart of the city. Its neon sign flickered against the night, casting a soft red glow onto the wet sidewalk. Inside, the hum of conversation mixed with the sizzle of grills and the clatter of dishes. The air smelled of fresh coffee and seared beef. It was the kind of place where no one cared who you were, as long as you looked like you belonged. And tonight, JD Vance did not look like he belonged. The doorbell jingled as he stepped inside. Heads didn't turn, no one gasped or whispered his name. He wasn't a politician here, just another customer. Perfect. JD liked it this way. He had spent years hearing politicians make empty promises about understanding the struggles of everyday Americans, yet they never truly stepped into their world. He wasn't here for a publicity stunt. He was here for truth. He took a corner booth away from the main crowd and picked up a sticky, laminated menu. The waitress, a young woman with sharp eyes and an impatient stance, passed his table without a glance. Odd, he thought, but he shrugged it off. When she finally returned, she barely looked at him. "What do you want?" she asked flatly, tapping a pen against her pad. JD glanced up. No smile, no greeting, just a voice dripping with indifference. "Steak and fries, medium rare, and a coffee." She scribbled down the order with a sigh. No confirmation, no got it. She simply walked away. JD leaned back in his seat, rubbing his hands together. Something felt off. Minutes passed. 10, then 20, then 40. He watched as the same waitress brought food to tables that had ordered long after him. Plates clattered in front of customers who had arrived well after he had taken his seat. But his table? Ignored. JD drummed his fingers against the table, his stomach tightening. Was this a mistake? An oversight? Or something worse? He shifted in his seat, waiting for a glance of acknowledgement, but the waitress wouldn't even look his way. She walked past him repeatedly, laughing with other customers, refilling coffee cups, delivering extra napkins, yet never stopping at his table. A slow realization crept over him. This wasn't bad service, this was deliberate. He looked down at his clothes. Just a simple hoodie, jeans, and unshaven stubble from a long day. They had no idea who he was. To them, he was nobody. And nobodies didn't matter. A flicker of something painful stirred in JD's chest. Not anger, not frustration. Something deeper. Sadness. Because if this was happening to him, the Vice President of the United States, how often was it happening to everyday Americans who didn't have power, didn't have a voice, didn't have a title to demand respect? How many men in work boots and flannel had sat in this same booth, feeling small, invisible, unworthy? JD clenched his jaw. He had to know. He stood up and walked toward the counter, his steps measured but firm. He wasn't here to start a fight. He was here for an answer. The waitress barely looked up when he approached. No recognition, no concern, just annoyance. JD took a deep breath. "Excuse me, ma'am, I placed my order nearly an hour ago. Can you check on it?" Her expression flickered between boredom and irritation. "Yeah, we're busy," she muttered, tapping numbers into the register. JD studied her face. There was no attempt to be polite, not even the bare minimum of customer service. And that's when he knew. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message. And JD Vance was about to send one of his own. JD Vance stood at the counter, his presence unnoticed, or rather, intentionally disregarded. The head waitress, the same one who had ignored him for nearly an hour, was now deliberately avoiding eye contact. She tapped aggressively on the cash register, as if the mere act of acknowledging him was an inconvenience. JD wasn't easily rattled. He had seen the struggles of everyday Americans, the factory workers, the veterans, the single parents scraping by paycheck to paycheck. But tonight, he wasn't just witnessing it. He was living it. "Ma'am," JD's voice was calm but firm, "I placed an order a while ago. Could you check on it?" The waitress finally glanced up, her expression bored and impatient. "Look, sir," she said, exhaling sharply, "maybe you should try somewhere else if you're in a hurry." Try somewhere else. JD Vance, Vice President of the United States, was being told to leave a public diner for daring to ask for his food. He could have flashed his credentials. He could have pulled rank and watched her expression shift from annoyance to fear in seconds. But that wasn't the point. The point was, this is what happens to people without power, without status, every single day. JD barely had time to process that thought when a voice cut through the air. "What's the problem here?" JD turned to see a man in a pressed shirt and apron, standing near the kitchen entrance. His stance was rigid, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The manager. And by the look in his eyes, he wasn't here to apologize. JD straightened, meeting his gaze evenly. "No problem," JD replied. "I was just wondering about my order." The manager's eyes flickered over JD's hoodie and jeans, his lips pressing into a thin, unimpressed line. He didn't see a leader, a man who had worked his way up from poverty to the second highest office in the nation. He saw a nobody. "We don't cater to," the manager started, then stopped himself, his jaw tightening as if realizing he was about to say something he shouldn't. JD narrowed his eyes. "Cater to who?" "You need to leave," the manager finally said, shifting his stance. JD blinked. "Excuse me?" "You're disturbing my staff," the manager continued, waving a dismissive hand. "Take your business somewhere else." JD studied him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, any indication that he might realize what he was doing was wrong. But there was nothing, just the cold certainty of a man who believed he could treat people however he wanted, without consequence. JD inhaled slowly. He wasn't going to cause a scene, but he wasn't about to be pushed around either. This was wrong, and he knew it. But before he could say another word, the manager lifted his hand and gestured toward the entrance. Two security guards, dressed in black, moved toward him. The Vice President of the United States was about to be thrown out of a restaurant, and nobody had any idea. The guards grabbed JD's arms, not aggressively, but firm enough to make it clear he wasn't welcome here. JD didn't resist. He didn't fight. He let them escort him through the diner, past the customers who had been served before him, past the employees who had ignored him, and through the doors into the cold night air. And that's when something shifted inside him. Not humiliation, because JD Vance didn't humiliate easily. Not anger, because anger wouldn't solve this problem. It was heartbreak. Not for himself, for America. For the people who walked into places like this every day, people who didn't have the luxury of power or influence, who were judged by their appearance, their clothes, the balance of their bank accounts. How many had been dismissed, kicked out, shamed, just like this? JD turned back to the diner, staring through the glass windows. Inside, the world continued as if nothing had happened. The manager had already returned to the counter, barking orders to the staff. The waitress who had ignored him was still serving other customers, laughing with them like she hadn't just tossed a paying customer into the street. JD reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen, then dialed a number. The line rang once, then twice. "Sir?" a familiar voice answered. "Agent Reynolds, his chief of security." JD took a slow breath, exhaling against the night air. "Get here now." A pause. Then the response came, steady and sharp. "Do you need extraction, sir?" JD's gaze didn't waver as he watched the people inside the diner go about their night, completely unaware of what was about to happen. "No," he said, voice unwavering. "I need witnesses." The silence on the other end was telling. Agent Reynolds understood immediately. "Understood, we're on our way." JD hung up and slipped his phone back into his pocket. The cold wind whipped around him, but he barely felt it. Because in a matter of minutes, the entire world was about to know what happened tonight. And what JD Vance was about to do next would leave everyone in shock. JD Vance stood outside Liberty Diner, the crisp night air biting against his skin. The glow from the neon sign above him flickered slightly, its warm light illuminating the pavement where he had just been unceremoniously thrown out. He could still hear the muffled chatter and laughter inside, the clinking of silverware, the hum of casual conversation, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and in a matter of minutes, the entire world would know. JD clenched his jaw, his mind racing. This wasn't about his meal anymore. This was about respect, about justice, about the millions of hard-working Americans who went through this same humiliation every day, except they didn't have a voice. Tonight, he would be that voice. A gust of wind rattled the diner's windows just as the first black SUV rolled up. The tires screeched slightly against the wet pavement as it came to a smooth halt. Then another vehicle, and another. The doors swung open in perfect synchronization, and men in suits stepped out, their earpieces glinting under the streetlights. Secret Service. The small group of customers sitting near the diner's window turned their heads, curiosity flashing across their faces. They knew something was happening, but they didn't know what. Yeah. The head waitress, still inside, caught a glimpse of the movement outside. Her brows furrowed as she whispered something to a nearby waiter. The manager, standing behind the counter with his arms crossed, didn't even look up. He had already dismissed JD as just another customer who didn't belong. That was about to change. JD adjusted his hoodie, the fabric slightly damp from the light drizzles still falling from the sky. He wasn't going to storm in there and demand an apology. No, that wasn't his style. He was going to do something much bigger. Two of his security team moved to flank him as he strode forward, his boots hitting the pavement with quiet determination. The door swung open, and this time, JD Vance wasn't just another dismissed customer. He was the Vice President of the United States. The moment he stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted instantly. At first, nobody reacted. The customers continued eating, the staff continued working, until the second wave of security followed him in. Then came the realization. The muffled conversation stopped, the clinking of plates halted, and the waitress who had ignored him now stood frozen, her face drained of color. The manager finally looked up, his smug expression melting into confusion as he took in the sight of the suited men surrounding the diner. JD walked with purpose, his eyes scanning the room before landing squarely on the man who had ordered him thrown out. The manager straightened, clearing his throat, but his voice came out noticeably weaker than before. Can I help you, sir?" JD tilted his head slightly, studying him. "Actually, I think it's time we had a conversation," JD said, his voice calm but commanding. The weight of those words sent a ripple through the restaurant. Whispers erupted among the customers. Someone gasped. A teenage girl near the entrance pulled out her phone, already recording. The manager paled. He opened his mouth, probably to deliver another dismissive response, but he seemed to think better of it. JD didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped forward. "You see," JD began, his voice carrying through the diner, "when I walked in here earlier tonight, I was just another man, just someone looking for a meal. I wasn't here as the vice president. I wasn't here with security. I was just JD Vance." A shuffling noise as the head waitress took a step back, eyes wide with realization. JD continued, his tone unwavering. "And I was ignored." Silence. Not just ignored, but dismissed. His gaze flickered toward the waitress before returning to the manager. "And then when I finally spoke up, I was thrown out. The manager swallowed thickly, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of JD's words. JD inhaled deeply before delivering the final blow. And that is exactly why I'm here now. The tension became suffocating. JD scanned the room, looking at the customers, the staff, the people who had witnessed everything and said nothing. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is about every American who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. Every person who has walked into a place like this and been treated as if they were invisible, as if their money didn't." JD's words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The head waitress was trembling now, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The manager looked like he wanted to disappear. JD turned his attention back to him. "Now, tell me," JD said, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful. "What would you have done if you had known who I was?" The manager's lips parted, but no words came. "Would you have treated me better?" JD asked, stepping even closer. "Would you have served me immediately, smiled, shown me respect?" Still, no answer. JD let the silence stretch, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Then he turned to the rest of the restaurant. "And that, right there, is the problem," he said. The customers shifted uncomfortably, some looking down at their plates. Others nodded in silent agreement. JD took one final step toward the counter, his blue eyes burning with intensity. "I may be the Vice President of the United States," he said, "but tonight I was just another American." He let that hang in the air before delivering the final line that would shake the entire nation. "And every American deserves to be treated with respect." Then, without another word, JD turned on his heel and walked back toward the door. And that's when the first phone went off. Then another, and another, because at that very moment, JD's video had gone live, and in just a few short minutes, millions of Americans would be watching. The entire country was about to witness what had happened here tonight, and nothing would ever be the same again. The moment JD Vance pressed the post button, the world shifted. It didn't take long. Within minutes, his video exploded across social media. The footage, raw, unfiltered, and deeply emotional, showed the Vice President of the United States sitting alone at a diner, waiting endlessly for his food. It showed him politely asking about his order, only to be dismissed, ignored, and thrown out like an afterthought. And it showed him returning, standing firm, and addressing the injustice with unwavering calm and determination. The clip spread like wildfire. It started with a few hundred shares, then a few thousand, before skyrocketing into millions. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, every platform was flooded with reactions. Breaking: Vice President JD Vance denied service and kicked out of diner. You won't believe his response. Respect. For all, JD Vance exposes the truth. The hashtags dominated the trending lists. Major news outlets scrambled to cover the story, dissecting every frame of the video. Within an hour, it was the most talked about event in the country. Miles away in the Oval Office, President Donald Trump sat at his desk, his phone buzzing relentlessly. His advisors stood near the doorway, watching as he clicked the video and let it play. The room was silent except for JD's voice, steady, commanding, raw with emotion. As the clip ended, Trump leaned back, his fingers tapping against the polished wood of his desk. "Unbelievable," he muttered. One of his aides hesitated before speaking. "Mr. President, this is everywhere. People are talking about it in every state. Conservatives, moderates, even some liberals. They're all rallying behind JD." Trump narrowed his eyes, processing the moment. He had always known JD had a fire inside him, but this was something else. "Set up a meeting with him first thing tomorrow," Trump ordered, his voice firm. "We're going to address this. The whole country needs to hear what he has to say." Back at Liberty Diner, the atmosphere had completely shifted. Phones buzzed across the restaurant as staff members checked the video in real time, their expressions twisting into horror as they realized exactly what had happened. The manager, the same man who had so confidently dismissed JD, stood behind the counter, his face pale, his hands trembling. The head waitress was glued to her screen, replaying the footage over and over, as if she could somehow change the past. The realization hit them like a freight train. They had just kicked out the Vice President of the United States, and the entire country was watching. The customers inside, now recognizing what had happened, whispered in hushed tones. Some stared at JD, who remained near the entrance, his posture calm but unreadable. A few diners pulled out their phones, recording the scene in real time. "Hey," one man whispered to his wife, "he's still here." "Do you think he's waiting for something?" another asked, watching JD carefully. The answer came swiftly, because at that moment the restaurant doors swung open again. A tall, gray-haired man in a tailored jacket stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding attention. The owner, the manager, visibly flinched. The owner's eyes swept across the room before locking on to JD Vance. He had seen the video. He knew exactly what had happened. And now he had to face the consequences. A tense silence followed as the owner strode forward, his footsteps sharp against the tile floor. The manager took a shaky step forward. "Sir, But the owner cut him off with a single look. Without a word, he turned to JD and extended his hand. "Mr. Vice President," he said, his voice stiff with unease, "I can't tell you how sorry I am for what happened tonight." JD studied the man for a long moment. Then he spoke. "Are you sorry because it was wrong?" JD asked, his voice even. "Or are you sorry because you got caught?" The manager visibly swallowed. The customers inside the diner held their breath. The owner hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I understand why you'd ask that, sir." He glanced around at his staff, at his manager, his waitresses, his cooks. "But let me be clear," he continued. "This was unacceptable, and it will never happen again." The head waitress's face crumpled in shame. The manager's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. JD remained silent, watching. "Wait." The owner took a deep breath. "I'm shutting this place down," he announced suddenly. A wave of gasps rippled through the restaurant. The manager's head snapped up. "Sir, wait." But the owner wasn't finished. "Not forever," he clarified, his voice firm. "But until we can guarantee that this restaurant will treat every customer with the respect they deserve." JD didn't react. He let the words sink in. Then, finally, he spoke. "That's a start," JD said, his voice still firm. "But words mean nothing without action." The owner nodded slowly. "Agreed." Then, turning to his employees, he delivered the words that would change everything. "Starting tomorrow, every single one of you will go through customer service training. You will learn what respect means, and if you can't follow those standards, you won't work here." The manager flinched. The head waitress turned ghostly pale. JD took a final glance around the room. He wasn't angry. He wasn't triumphant. He was satisfied. Because this was just the beginning. The customers inside the restaurant burst into applause. And outside, on the internet, the movement had already begun. The restaurant doors had barely shut before the firestorm outside reached a fever pitch. News crews had arrived, their cameras rolling, capturing every second of what had just happened inside Liberty Diner. JD Vance, the Vice President of the United States, had been ignored, mistreated, and thrown out of a restaurant. And the entire world was watching. But this wasn't just about one bad night. This was about millions of Americans who had faced the same treatment. In stores, in businesses, in daily life, judged for how they looked, how they dressed, how much money they had in their pockets. Now the debate was boiling over. It was as if the internet had caught fire. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram exploded with reaction posts, with hashtags flooding the trending list within minutes. Justice for JD. Respect all customers. Liberty Diner exposed. On one side, conservatives and everyday Americans rallied behind JD. They saw his experience as proof of what they had always suspected, that the elites, the media, and certain businesses treated regular Americans with disrespect. Thousands of stories poured in. I walked into a store in my work clothes after a long shift. They treated me like I didn't belong. I've been ignored at restaurants just because I looked poor. JD Vance is standing up for all of us. This is why people are sick of elites looking down on us. JD didn't just talk, he lived it. But on the other side, the left-wing media and Hollywood celebrities scrambled to control the narrative. Liberal news anchors downplayed the event, calling JD's experience an overreaction. One MSNBC host sneered, "He's the Vice President of the United States. If he wanted a meal that bad, he could have ordered in." Late-night comedians took cheap shots, trying to twist the story into a joke. "Oh, poor JD Vance. Imagine getting bad service at a restaurant. How will he ever recover?" But their sarcasm backfired, because millions of working-class Americans weren't laughing. They had seen the footage. They had felt what JD felt. They knew what it was like to be dismissed, ignored, and judged, and they weren't going to let this moment be brushed aside. Inside his office at the vice president's residence, JD Vance sat at his desk, staring at the screen. The numbers were staggering. His video had gained 20 million views in just 6 hours. Every news station was talking about it. This wasn't just a viral moment. This was a movement. His aide knocked on the door. "Sir, President Trump is on the line." JD picked up. "Mr. President?" Trump's voice was sharp, direct. "This is bigger than we thought, JD. The American people aren't just angry, they're ready for change." JD leaned back, exhaling. "I know. I've been reading their messages all night." Trump's voice grew serious. "We need to speak to the country about this. Hold a press conference. Address the people directly." JD nodded. It was time. The next morning, the White House press room was packed. Every major news outlet had cameras rolling. The room was buzzing with speculation. Then JD Vance stepped up to the podium. He didn't carry notes. He didn't need them. His voice was strong, clear, full of conviction. "Last night, I walked into a restaurant dressed like an average American. I sat down, waited patiently, and was ignored. When I asked why, I was dismissed. When I tried again, I was thrown out." Silence. "I wasn't angry. I wasn't looking for sympathy. But standing outside that diner, I realized something. This wasn't just about me. This happens to people every single day." The reporters sat frozen, their pens still. How many hard-working Americans have been looked down on, ignored, mistreated, all because they didn't look the part? How many veterans, single parents, blue-collar workers, and struggling citizens have walked into a business and been treated like they didn't belong? JD's eyes burned with emotion. This isn't just about one restaurant. This is about a culture that has forgotten what respect means. And I am here today to say, no more. The room erupted into applause. Across the country, JD's words struck a chord. Business owners began reevaluating their policies. Some issued public statements, promising to train their staff to treat every customer with dignity. One major restaurant chain announced a nationwide initiative. Every guest, no matter what they wear, no matter their background, will be treated with the same level of respect. We're better than this. But not everyone was happy. The liberal media was furious. The same news anchors who mocked JD the night before were now scrambling to discredit him. "This is all political theater," sneered one CNN host. "JD Vance is just using a simple misunderstanding to stir division." But the problem? Nobody was buying it. JD hadn't staged anything. He hadn't complained. He hadn't called for boycotts or protests. He had simply told the truth. And that truth was too powerful to ignore. Meanwhile, back at Liberty Diner, the changes were already underway. The owner had followed through, shutting down the restaurant temporarily to retrain every employee. The manager, the same man who had thrown JD out, was fired. The head waitress, shaken and remorseful, stayed, determined to do better. The restaurant was scheduled to reopen with a new name, The American Table, a place where every customer would be treated with dignity. And on opening night, JD Vance would be their first guest. JD had never expected his quiet dinner to ignite a national conversation, but it had. And now, businesses everywhere were being forced to ask themselves, are we treating every customer with respect? Are we serving only those who look the part? Are we truly living up to the American standard of dignity for all? This wasn't just about one night at a restaurant. This was about America itself. And thanks to JD Vance, the conversation had only just begun. The backlash came like a tidal wave. JD Vance's speech had struck a nerve, but not everyone was celebrating. The media elite, Hollywood celebrities, and liberal pundits scrambled to control the damage. They knew that if this moment wasn't shut down immediately, it would become unstoppable, a turning point in how Americans viewed themselves, their businesses, and the very fabric of respect and dignity in everyday life. Inside the headquarters of MSNBC, CNN, and several major networks, emergency meetings were held. Producers barked orders, writers scrambled to draft hit pieces. Editors sifted through years of footage, looking for anything they could use against JD Vance. We need to discredit him, one executive snapped in frustration. Find something, anything, on him, another chimed in. The marching orders were clear. If JD Vance was allowed to own this moment, if his message continued to resonate, then it wouldn't just be a political win for conservatives. It would be a cultural shift that no liberal stronghold could reverse. And that terrified them. The next morning, cable news anchors were already in damage control mode. CNN's Anderson Cooper looked straight into the camera, his voice smooth, controlled, almost rehearsed. The outrage over Vice President JD Vance's restaurant experience may not be as simple as it seems. Some reports suggest this was an orchestrated stunt, a political setup designed to inflame conservative viewers. A split-screen graphic showed JD Vance's speech on one side and a blurred image of Liberty Diner's employees on the other, framing the restaurant workers as victims rather than aggressors. Over on MSNBC, Rachel Maddow's voice dripped with skepticism. "It's convenient, isn't it?" she mused, shaking her head. JD Vance, a politician who rails against elitism, just happens to get kicked out of a restaurant, records it, and suddenly, he's a hero of the working class? The narrative had flipped. Suddenly, JD wasn't the victim. He was the manipulator, the opportunist, the right-wing puppet stirring controversy for personal gain. Hollywood elites joined in. Talk show hosts like Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert mocked JD on air, calling his experience fake outrage, while left-wing Twitter mobs flooded the internet with accusations. JD Vance staged this whole thing. This was a political stunt? He's just another MAGA grifter. The liberal machine had one goal: bury the truth, discredit the movement, destroy JD Vance. But there was one problem. Americans weren't buying it. JD Vance had not staged a thing. And the American people knew it. For every hit piece, for every TV host trying to spin the story, millions of everyday Americans pushed back. On social media, working-class voices fought back hard. This wasn't staged. It happens every day. Maybe you don't see it because you're too busy sipping cocktails in New York and LA. They're panicking because JD Vance exposed something real. Liberals keep talking about injustice, but when a Republican actually experiences it, they call it fake. "We Stand with JD" began trending worldwide. And then something even bigger happened. Business owners started speaking out. A truck driver from Texas posted a video. "I walked into a diner last week in my work clothes. They looked at me like I was dirt. JD, I know exactly how you felt." A single mom from Ohio shared her story. "I was ignored at a store because they thought I couldn't afford anything. No cameras, no security, just me and my daughter, being treated like we didn't exist." The stories kept coming. The nation was waking up, and no amount of media spin could put this fire out. For 3 days, JD Vance stayed silent. He didn't rush to Twitter. He didn't fight back in anger. He waited, watched. Then, on the 4th day, he struck. In a single, powerful video posted across all platforms, JD spoke directly to the American people. "I said I faked it, that I staged the whole thing, but here's the truth." He played the raw footage. The waitress ignoring him, the manager sneering, the moment security was called to throw him out. This wasn't politics. This wasn't a stunt. This was reality. He let the silence linger. And the only reason they're panicking is because I didn't just expose one restaurant. I exposed a mindset, a culture that looks down on hard-working Americans. JD leaned forward, his voice steady, controlled, but unshakable. So, I have one question for the media, the celebrities, the so-called elites. When was the last time you walked into a restaurant as a regular person? When was the last time you weren't recognized, weren't catered to, weren't treated with special privilege? He let the weight of his words settle. Because for millions of Americans, what happened to me isn't just a headline, it's their daily reality. The video ended, and the impact was immediate. 10 million views in 2 hours, 25 million by midnight. Cable news scrambling for damage control. But it was too late. JD had won. As JD's video spread, the liberal media's attempts to smear him crumbled. Fact-checkers were forced to admit there was no evidence of staging. News outlets backpedaled, shifting from "this was fake" to "maybe this was a misunderstanding." Even some liberal voices admitted the truth. Maybe we judged too fast. Maybe JD was onto something real. And then the final blow came. Liberty Diner released a statement. The owner himself admitted, "What happened that night was wrong. JD Vance was mistreated, and we take full responsibility. We are making permanent changes to ensure no customer is ever judged by their appearance or status again." The truth had won. JD Vance hadn't just survived the biggest media assault of his career. He had flipped the script. He had forced a national conversation that the elites never wanted to have. And the best part? He wasn't done yet. JD Vance had won the battle, but now he was determined to win the war. The public outcry had shaken the nation. Millions of Americans had finally seen in real time the ugly truth about how judgment and prejudice affect everyday people. But JD knew one viral video wasn't enough. There had to be real change. And so he returned to Liberty Diner, but this time not as a customer. When JD arrived at Liberty Diner the following evening, a massive crowd had already gathered outside. Reporters jostled for space, cameras flashed, and everyday people, truckers, waitresses, small business owners, and blue-collar workers stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting to see what would happen next. But inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was much different. The manager, the one who had ordered JD to be thrown out, now sat at a table, his hands folded, his face pale. The head waitress, the same woman who had ignored JD as if he were invisible, stood near the counter, her eyes red from tears and regret. They had spent the last 48 hours being bombarded with calls, emails, and walk-ins, not to support them, but to demand accountability. Then came the worst part. The restaurant owner, an older man with silver hair and tired eyes, walked in and looked around at his staff. His voice was steady but cold. "This is your mess," he said to the manager, "and now you're going to clean it up." The weight of those words hung in the air as the restaurant doors opened, and in stepped JD Vance, the same man they had laughed at, ignored, humiliated, and thrown onto the street. But now he was back. And this time, the entire world was watching. JD didn't walk in with anger or arrogance. He didn't demand punishment or retribution. Instead, he offered a challenge. Stepping to the center of the restaurant, he looked directly at the staff, the manager, the waitresses, even the kitchen workers peeking nervously from the back. "I'm not here for an apology," JD said, his voice firm yet steady. "I already told America what happened here. But now, I want to do something bigger. I want to prove a point." The crowd outside pressed against the glass, listening intently. "So, here's what we're going to do," JD continued. "For the next 2 hours, you're not the ones running this restaurant anymore." A murmur spread through the room. "You're going to switch places with the customers. You're going to sit where I sat, wait like I waited, and be treated exactly the way you treated me." The manager stiffened. The head waitress swallowed hard. But JD wasn't finished. "Some of you will get great service," JD said. "Others, not so much. You'll be ignored, you'll be dismissed, you might even get thrown out. And then, when it's over, we'll talk about what we all learned." The restaurant owner looked at his staff. "You heard him," he said. "Sit down." And so, for the first time in their lives, the people who had judged others for their appearance, their clothes, and their status were about to experience what it felt like to be on the other side. For the first 15 minutes, the former restaurant staff sat uncomfortably in their seats. Some were served right away, greeted with smiles and warm conversation. Others were ignored completely. The manager sat at the same corner booth where JD had waited for nearly an hour, and just like JD, no one came to take his order. The head waitress tried to flag down a waiter. "Excuse me," she started, but the worker just walked past her without a glance. Her face turned red. After 30 minutes, frustration boiled over. "This is ridiculous," the manager blurted out, standing up. JD, who had been sitting at a nearby table, calmly stood and looked him in the eye. "Now you know how it feels." The manager froze, his breath coming in shallow. The realization hit him like a freight train. The waitress, tears welling up in her eyes, lowered her head in shame. The restaurant was dead silent. JD stepped forward. This was the moment that mattered most. "What you just experienced isn't just about a restaurant," JD said, his voice calm but unwavering. "It's about how we treat each other. It's about what happens when we judge people before we even know their names." The waitress sniffled. The manager ran a hand over his face. "This wasn't about humiliating you," JD continued. "This was about showing you what it feels like, because the only way to change is to understand." He looked around at the restaurant, at the crowd watching outside, at the people whose lives had been forever changed by this one experience. "If you want to make things right," JD said, "don't just say it, show it, prove it." The manager looked at his employees, then at the customers who had come to witness this moment. He took a deep breath, then stood up and turned to JD. "I get it now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I really do." JD nodded, then offered his hand. The manager took it. And in that moment, something changed. Not just for this restaurant, but for every single person watching. A woman in the back wiped away a tear. A man near the door nodded in quiet agreement. The crowd outside broke into applause. The lesson had been learned. But JD wasn't finished yet, because his next move would send shockwaves across the entire nation. JD Vance had done more than just teach a lesson inside Liberty Diner. He had ignited a fire across America. By the next morning, the video of his experience had exploded online, racking up millions of views in just hours. Social media, cable news, and talk radio were on fire, with people from all walks of life weighing in. Truck drivers, factory workers, teachers, veterans, and single parents, all sharing their own stories of being treated unfairly based on how they looked, how they dressed, or where they came from. But it wasn't just ordinary Americans who had taken notice. The White House had been watching too. JD was sitting at his desk, staring at his phone, watching the endless flood of messages and notifications when it buzzed in his hand. A call from the Oval Office. He answered immediately. "JD," came the unmistakable voice of President Donald Trump, firm yet filled with something deeper. "I saw the video. America saw the video." JD exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had expected a reaction, but not this kind of reaction. "Mr. President, it was more than just a restaurant," Trump interrupted. "You held up a mirror to the whole damn country." There was a pause, thick with meaning. "I want you to come to the White House tomorrow," Trump continued. "We're addressing the nation, together." JD's grip tightened on the phone. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. The next evening, the White House press room was packed. Reporters filled every seat, camera crews set up their live feeds, and millions of Americans sat at home, waiting for what would come next. At precisely 8 p.m., JD Vance walked out, standing beside President Trump. The room fell silent. Trump leaned forward, resting his hands on the podium, his voice slow and deliberate. "What happened to JD Vance shouldn't happen to any American," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "Not to a veteran, not to a truck driver, not to the guy in a hoodie trying to get a hot meal. This isn't just about one restaurant, it's about who we are as a country." He turned to JD. "Tell them what you told me." JD stepped up, looking straight into the cameras, into the eyes of America. "I didn't walk into that diner as the vice president," he said. "I walked in as just another guy. And for a little while, I got to feel what so many hard-working Americans feel every single day. Ignored, judged, dismissed, thrown out." His voice thickened with emotion. "I was lucky. I had a platform, I had cameras. But what about the single mom working 2 jobs? What about the veteran who sacrificed everything for this country only to be treated like he doesn't matter?" JD paused. "This isn't about politics," he continued. "This is about something much bigger. It's about respect. It's about dignity. It's about the way we treat each other, whether we wear a suit or a pair of worn-out jeans." The room was dead silent. "So, I challenge every American watching this, business owners, workers, customers, neighbors, ask yourself one simple question." JD leaned forward. "You treat people the way you'd want to be treated." A murmur spread through the press room. Across America, people sat in their living rooms, their hearts pounding. This wasn't just a speech. This was a movement. By the next morning, restaurants, businesses, and organizations across the country had responded. Some issued apologies, admitting they had unknowingly treated customers unfairly. Others vowed to retrain their staff on respect and dignity. A national Respect Matters movement began trending on social media, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences, both of mistreatment and of kindness. Even Liberty Diner itself had undergone a complete transformation. Now reopened under a new name, the American Table, it became a symbol of change. JD returned on opening night, not as a politician, but as a guest. And this time, he was served right away. JD Vance had set out for a simple meal. Instead, he had started a national conversation about judgment, prejudice, and respect. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't about a restaurant or a viral video. It was about America itself. And thanks to one quiet moment of injustice, the nation would never look at how it treated people the same way again. JD Vance's experience wasn't just about one night at a restaurant. It was about a nation waking up. His quiet yet powerful stand reminded us all that respect should never be determined by wealth, status, or appearance. Every American deserves dignity, whether they're wearing a suit or a hoodie, whether they have a title or not. This story is a powerful lesson for modern life. How we treat others defines who we are as a society. If JD Vance's experience moved you, let's keep this conversation going. Like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more eye-opening stories that challenge, inspire, and spark real change. Because at the end of the day, change starts with awareness, and awareness starts with you. Let's make America a place where respect isn't a privilege, but a right.